A brief history on warfare. How did we go from such humble beginnings as agrarian civilizations to large, sprawling metropolises? Well, that's more of an economics question, not actually a warfare question, but war is funded by economics, and without the space to expand, you wouldn't really have a lot. Ancient warfare mostly consisted of spears, as they were very easy to make, as seen in the pictures. They were well known, and back in the Paleolithic era, it is estimated that from 500 through 500,000 years of the human evolution chain, roughly about 450,000 of which were years of peace were attributed to the spear alone. Which, of course, now spears aren't exactly commonplace, but that's mostly because there are tons of things that can outrange a spear. And then we move on to Agrarian Times, which is caused by the agriculture of the threshold of agriculture. It's not exactly a very spectacular time. Spears still dominated this age. They were still very popular. They had better methods of casting them, so they had better weapons that would break less often and have to be replaced less often. And then eventually we discovered ironworking and more complicated methods of metallurgy, so we started constructing better and better spears, as spears were still the most dominant force even into the Greeks and Roman times. As a matter of fact, most of the Greek forces consisted of hoplites, which were armored soldiers that usually had a small bronze shield, armor constructed of bronze, and bronze spears. And considering Greece's location, they live in a very mountainous region, so they had a lot of ore to work with, which gave them an edge in combat against regions that were in a more flatland area, because if you're in a flatland, there's not going to be as many obvious places to mine as, say, if you were in a very mountainous region. So then this led eventually into the Dark Ages, where not much progress was made, so nothing spectacular exactly happened until the medieval era, when more complicated methods of sieging were constructed, as well as defending from sieging, such as ballista, which were really big crossbows, specifically designed to fire very large bolts that would do considerable damage to anything either heading your way or walls that were trying to stop your path. Another popular method of sieging were trebuchets, which used the Earth's natural gravity to throw a bag that was usually filled with heavy rocks into enemy walls, which would at least weaken them, if not take them down. Which, if your enemy has a giant hole in their wall, that allows your troops to advance and siege the city even further. And then this goes into different types of weaponry, as there were steel and other forms of weaponry. There were swords started taking hold because they could construct longer swords that could counter a spear, and plus a spear only has a very small area where it can actually cut and do damage, whereas a sword has a much longer blade and can inflict much more damage at a much lower rate. This led to swords like the long sword, falchions, broadswords, and there were popular smaller blades like daggers and knives, but they weren't as popular as the lack of range put them at a much bigger risk. Blunt weapons also started showing up, like the flanged mace and morning stars, as well as flails and warhammers. There were still polearms, and there were a lot more of them than just spears. Spears were still fairly common, but now there were winged spears, lances, pikes, glaives, and halberds, which, given how the most common method of transportation at the time was in fact by horseback, having a longer weapon that could be angled upwards could very easily help defend you from enemy forces, because even if you didn't hit your opponent, you would at least hopefully hit their horse, which would severely slow down their progress. And the threshold for that was more advanced technology and a better advancement in metallurgy, mostly steel, which would eventually date into gunpowder-based weapons once the Europeans started trading more with the Chinese, and they eventually got around to getting better ranged weapons. Instead of throwing axes and javelins and bows and longbows, it would eventually lead into construction of better ranged weaponry, such as the most common type of weapon at the time would have been a matchlock pistol, which were not exactly the best type of weapon, which would eventually lead into flintlocks. However, the first type of firearm that we know of is a hand cannon, which is not quite as spectacular as it sounds. Looking at it, it kind of looks like a bell almost, just without the centerpiece. And of course, eventually this would lead into muzzle-loaded firearms, which would be very long to improve accuracy and allow better control, and you would normally need a stick to hold it up, kind of like a sling. And these didn't fire the most complicated of ammunition. They were basically shooting rocks out. Smoothed rocks out of the barrel of their gun. And then, as the name implies, as a matchlock, you needed a match to ignite the powder in the barrel and fire, which made stealth attacks very difficult until the invention of the wheel lock. And then, of course, there's the Renaissance, all the way up through the Industrial Era and the modern eras, which had a huge amount of advancements in technology. Because a lot of stuff happened. Flintlocks became more commonplace, and larger cannons were employed on ships as a method of defense, because early naval warfare relied on ramming your opponent's ship with your ship. which wasn't exactly the safest method at the time. And of course, cannonballs at the time were rounded and didn't have a whole lot of power behind them. They could easily rip through wood, but if you were trying to fire on stone, it would be a lot harder to take it down if you were trying to take a seaport. So eventually this led to a rounded bullet, which had a much easier time piercing through stone walls and making sieges a lot easier. So this would eventually lead to more and more need for better equipment, so this would eventually lead into the invention of the lever action rifle, which would eventually keep advancing and becoming more and more complex until we reach semi-automatic weapons and smokeless gunpowder, because early gunpowder was black powder and it left a lot of smoke when it was fired, which made stealth strikes, if you missed a stealth strike, you would be very obvious. Because first off, they would hear the bullet, so they'd be looking in the direction that it was fired from, and if they see smoke, they're obviously going to assume you're there, and they're going to open fire and try to take you down. So smokeless powder made it a lot harder to be located, meaning your opponents had to rely completely on sound if you fired a shot their way. So they would have a much harder time trying to find you, making stealth a lot easier. And semi-automatics were easier to fire because early lever action rifles were they were different from muzzleloaders in the fact that they had loading breeches, except some of the earlier ones, like the ones made during the Civil War time, had a lever that actually came down and pushed the bullet into the chamber. And eventually, because of the way you had to hold the gun, eventually the lever would hit your hand, which made it very uncomfortable at times, because you would have to move your hand out of the way, which isn't something a lot of people are very comfortable doing, which would eventually lead to guns that fed into the top of the barrel rather than the bottom of the barrel, which is where clips come into play, as they would allow you to hold a bullet instead of trying to load bullets in while you're being shot at. You could just load in a clip and then push the bullets down into the barrel. And this would also lead to mag-fed guns, which would enable you to, of course, be able to have better control, and it would allow for much easier reloading, and much less time was spent reloading as a general fact, which allowed battles to be fought even quicker. We didn't advance much in terms of siege units. We did advance to more aerial-based strikes, more vertically inclined attacks rather than horizontal, with the invention of mobile artillery and other such creations. And the next threshold that I have is atomic fission, which would be at the end of World War II, which would begin with the dropping of the first atomic bomb. This, of course, Little Boy and Fat Man would end up ending World War II and causing major devastation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, making them uninhabitable for a decade or so. The bombs would function by, once they had been primed and were dropped, they would start undergoing the process of fission, which would split the bond between the atoms, which when you split a bond, a huge amount of energy can be released. And given how they were using very radioactive materials, the devastation released by this would lead to radiation poisoning. High amounts of heat were released. And if you were within the blast radius, it would be a very bad time for you. Because if you were anywhere within a certain distance of ground zero, there would be ashes, and that would mark the spot where you stood. They weren't very pleasant weapons, and as such the Geneva Convention would promptly ban their use in warfare against civilian and military units alike. After the Civil and World War II, we would go on into the nuclear arms race against the Soviet Union, which was basically, they built a bomb, we would build more bombs, and it would just continue increasing tensions, which would lead to the space race and other such noteworthy things. In this time, several key inventions were made. I don't remember quite off the top of my head what year it was, but the .50 caliber was invented by Mr. Browning. It's the term 50 BMG, which stands for Browning Machine Gun. Machine guns would alter the flow of war. Mechanized warfare was becoming much more common, and better planes were invented. The first supersonic planes were invented in the atomic era, which they were mostly used as spy planes and reconnaissance sources, so that way they could scout out a region and see what was going on. The most popular of which would be the SR-71 Blackbird, which is an American-constructed ship plane, which would be able to go roughly about Mach 1 and be able to effectively provide reconnaissance at a much higher altitude, making them and its unique painting made it much harder to locate, as its painting didn't reflect radio waves, but rather absorb them, which would keep them in the dark about whether or not there was an opponent flying over their heads. During the arms race, several key things would happen. The space race would, of course, lead the Russians to space and America to the moon. And it was a very heated race, as there was a lot of tension between the Soviets and the Americans, which of course would go up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1980. However, just a few years earlier, in the 70s, we would be introduced to a new invention that, even though it had existed since the 30s, was just now being released to the public, which would be PCs. Now, earlier computers back from the 30s would take up entire rooms of space. So these computers were still pretty big and bulky, but they got the job done. And they were significantly smaller, as they didn't exactly take up an entire room's worth of space, but mostly just a foot or so of space. They weren't exactly the most complex machines originally. They were pretty complicated, but they weren't as complicated as today's computers. Which, of course, would lead to the dawn of the information age, which would lead to much faster methods of communication through the internet, and much faster methods of transportation, as we do have much faster craft than we did way back in the 40s and during the Cold War. Guided missiles became much more commonplace, so that way you had less room for error if you had to manually drive the craft through some sort of special program than if you had it automated and locked onto a target. It would have a much less room for error. Anti-ballistic missiles were made, so that way if a missile was heading for you, you could fire a missile at that missile to stop that missile's progress. Which would lead to, eventually, much more complex warfare strategies, as you would have to plan out things better. And there were much less casualties in war as stuff started becoming more and more computer program driven, such as unmanned aerial vehicles, which some people refer to as drones, would allow for the pilot to be in a safe spot far away from the plane, so in case the plane did end up getting shot down and destroyed, the pilot and the crew would not die along with the plane or risk being captured. And this would have less destruction, as aircraft, well, they did still have very powerful weapons on them. They wouldn't have to use them as much, because unless they were actually going into an area with warfare, typically drones are only used as reconnaissance. And actually, as recently, as of December 2014, the Pentagon released a statement saying that the U.S. Navy has weaponized lasers, even though lasers have existed since roughly, it's hard to trace the date actually, because there have been claims of solar rays since the Greeks' time, but we know that lasers became much more commonplace roughly around the discovery of neodymium, which is a very, very good way to create a laser and maintain a stable laser. However, we still can find better methods of projecting lasers. But weaponization is something that can be a problem at times, because eventually we will find a way to weaponize even simpler things. Thankfully, if it is deemed immoral, the Geneva Conventions will intervene and prevent the weapon's use. Other such weapons of modern times would consist more of stealth bombers, like the B-52, which had a design that was very unique, as it can be used as a vertical takeoff, which is a thing similarly used to helicopters and carrier planes, which are typically used to transport troops from one area to another. And of course, it's much sleeker design, made it much harder to detect on a vertical plane or horizontal plane, and its specially designed paint that covers it keeps radar waves from detecting it. Hence the term stealth bomber, making radars much, much more obsolete when it comes to warfare, as you can't exactly see a stealth bomber as easily as you could see, say, a fighter jet. Although it would still be very hard to see both, as a fighter jet can travel at speeds of Mach 1 or 2, and B-52s fly at extremely high altitudes, along with other stealth bombers, which can be a problem for trying to take out spots of interest, especially if they're precise, because the way that aerodynamics works isn't very linear. It might seem linear, but the way that gravity can affect speed and trajectory and velocity can make you miss. And the higher you are, the more likely you are to miss your intended target. And of course, if you are as a bomber, if you effectively dip down low enough that you can get a guaranteed shot, you'll be shot down beforehand due to auto-targeting anti-aircraft and other such things, as it's much easier to see a plane at a lower altitude. And of course, if you're spotted by ground forces, odds are eventually word's going to get that there's a bomber, and if it spreads really quickly, then your plane is going to get shot down before it can reach the bottom of the area. Which is why artillery and anti-aircraft are very common in places where warfare happens a lot, because if your enemy's trying to launch an offensive on you, they can't exactly launch an offensive if their plane's currently being shot at. And because of the creation of lighter and stronger alloys, this makes mechanized warfare much harder, as you would require either a bigger bullet or a faster speed to go through a harder to break metal. Which also stems into tanks and other forms of mechanized ground forces, because a lighter vehicle with armor that can withstand a lot more will become a lot harder to take it down, as a general rule of thumb. Because back in World War II, armor on tanks was either light, but could be taken out by much lighter weapons, or it was thicker and your tank moves slower. And if your tank moves slower, you're more likely to be able to be surrounded by enemy forces, and at that point it'd be kind of pointless to fight, because if you did try to fire a shot, odds are one of them is located a weak spot in your armor, and that is not a good thing. So with stronger and better alloys, along with more and more digitalization and more complicated programming, it seems like we're saving lives. Which is good because it showed in our population that we are still rising. However, there is still several larger threats, such as the possibility of a nuclear war and other forms of banned weapons, which are still a threat, even though they've been banned by the Geneva Conventions. If another country were to use them, what's to stop a country fighting said country? What's stopping them from also breaking the rules? Now, if they do avoid breaking the rules and end up winning, then that's good. Because eventually that country will have to face international charges of war crimes. But of course, no country is exactly free from controversy. And this is also running a bit long, so I'm going to have to cut it here.